Faith Radio.
Glory to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit.
This is Orthodoxy Live with Father Evan Armatas, a live interactive call-in program where your questions about the Orthodox faith are addressed. Father Evan is the priest at St. Spiridon Greek Orthodox Church in Loveland, Colorado. Call in your question at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Here now is Father Evan.
Well, good evening and welcome to Orthodoxy Live, your live call-in show about the Orthodox faith, her teachings, and her traditions. I'm your host, Father Evan, and we're streaming to you live here on Ancient Faith Radio. I'm glad you're with us. It's February 5th, 2023. We look forward to taking your calls this evening, and you can reach us by dialing in at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-AF-RADIO. Of course, if you're listening to this program, doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you cannot dial in, you can still send a question. You can do that at orthodoxylive@ancientfaith.com, or you can go ahead and go to ancientfaith.com, click on live radio, scroll down to Orthodoxy Live. You'll find a microphone button there, and you can record a question while we're on air, or if you're listening to this program later as a podcast, or gosh, even years down the road, months down the road, you can still send your questions to that email, orthodoxylive@ancientfaithradio.com, or by clicking on that microphone button and recording your question. If you haven't yet subscribed to the program, I encourage you to do so. Now, before we get to our first call tonight, I just want to make mention that tonight is February 5th. And today in churches across the globe, in the Orthodox world, we heard our first reading signaling the start of the Triodion period. If you were in an Orthodox parish this morning and you attended the early Matins service, the Ortho service, part of the daily office, you will have heard from the first time the penitential troparia. This is a series of hymns read after the morning gospel that recognize the need to address our brokenness and our soul sickness, and our departure from the way forward towards a relationship with Christ. And then, if you were in the liturgy, you will have heard the first gospel announcing the season, that of the publican and the Pharisee. So encourage you, if you didn't attend a church today, or even if you did, if you want to take a look and hear a little bit more about that and the meaning of that gospel and the start of the season, you can go to stspiridon.church, or you can check out St. Spiridon Orthodox Church in Loveland, Colorado's YouTube feed and just watch the sermon there today as I spoke about that key that unlocks all of the virtues during our journey of humility as we get going on our Lenten journey. Of course, on Ancient Faith, you'll notice in the store lots of places you can go to find resources for the journey, books and such. And also, there's a banner on Ancient Faith where you can click into the Lenten Embassy and the Pascha passports and all that is available with that resource. Well, as I said, as we open up the program, we've got two guests on the line, and we're going to bring them on right now. Michael and Kyra, are you there?
Kira.
Oh,
Hi.
I
Yes,
apologize,
how are you?
Kira, for pronouncing that incorrectly.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Kira, is your name Kyriaki? Is that your full name?
It is, yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, every Sunday then's your name's day.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much for having us on, Father Evan.
You're so welcome. Kira and Michael, you both work for something that I think a lot of people are probably not all that familiar with, the Orthodox Volunteer Corps. So, why don't you tell us just briefly what that is before we get into your questions, but and maybe a place that people can find more information.
Sure, I can start. The Orthodox Volunteer Corps is an intensive opportunity for young adults, 21 to 29 years old, to spend 10 months in service, in formation in their faith, living in community, and engaging the church. It's a program that began the programming just several months ago. The first cohort started in the fall of this year, and we are now recruiting for our second cohort. And it has been just an incredible blessing to see the first members of this cohort grow in a variety of ways, serving on the front lines, learning more deeply about their faith and also about leadership development at a community-based level, and then really supporting one another through living in Christian community, and then all of this thing being undergirded by the church. And so these core members are engaging in local parishes in really profound ways. So that's just a quick word on Orthodox Volunteer Corps.
Kira, how is it that you got involved?
Sure. So I used to work for the Crossroads Summer Institute for many years, and there was a gathering that Crossroad was included in at the Archdiocese on how is the church addressing the crisis of homelessness. And representatives from a variety of Orthodox social service agencies and ministries that work with that population in some capacity came together to talk about what can we be doing, more effectively. And one of the ideas that kept emerging was, well, we need folks in our communities who not only care about issues like homelessness, but have direct experience serving these populations and know how to do so effectively. And so many of us were familiar with this model of a service volunteer corps, a year-long, immersive program as it's existed for, about over 40 years in other Christian traditions, in secular spaces. And so we said, many of us said, we need an Orthodox volunteer corps. So I was in that gathering, as was Michael, and many others, and the Assembly of Bishops commissioned a working group. And so for 2 years, a bunch of us volunteered to research and develop and get Orthodox Volunteer Corps off the ground. So while our official programming didn't begin until this past fall, it's a ministry that's been in the works for a long time, and it's very near and dear to both of our hearts. And it's something I know, when I had graduated college, I would have loved to do a program like OBC. So it's amazing to be part of it now.
Well, just again, to remind our listeners, you're listening to Orthodoxy Live here on February 5th. We're live. The phone number to call in is 1-855-237-2346. If you happen to want to ask a question of both Kira and Michael about C, you can do that. Interestingly, I'm in my mid-50s. I was in college back in the 80s, and I was at a Jesuit college and took part in something almost identical that was set up and run through basically an association of Catholic universities. And a number of people that I graduated with went right into that volunteer corps after graduation. And, an incredible experience. My time was a year. I did it during my sophomore year, but what a profound impact it had on me. I'm so happy that something like this is now available for Orthodox Christians. I've been on your website, orthodoxvolunteercorps.org, and I've poked around. I've heard through the grapevine things are getting started. So I'm so excited that kind of things are off the ground and that you've got your first cohort out there. And you mentioned, Michael, that the second cohort you're starting to recruit.
We are starting to recruit. In fact, we're actually almost at the end of our recruitment cycle. We have talked to so many young adults and heard just a lot of interest for this work. Our recruitment cycle actually ends tomorrow evening at midnight Pacific time, when our applications are due. And a bunch of folks have applied already, but there is still time. If you're a young adult and you're listening to this and you're 21 to 29 years old and you are interested in diving into service, diving into your faith, we often speak about this is an opportunity to live your faith with your whole life. Mm-hmm. If that sounds attractive to you, then we really encourage you to go to the website, orthodoxvolunteercorps.org. There's an opportunity to apply right online there, and you still have time to do so if you would like to.
Being someone who has been part of initiatives such as this, both at the parish level and the national level, I also want to just point out that for people who are interested in what you're doing, Orthodox Volunteer Corps, but perhaps cannot attend or participate themselves, there's ways that they can participate as well. Prayer, for this incredible burgeoning new ministry. I'm sure they could volunteer in some way to assist in the work that you're doing by becoming some of maybe a liaison. Is there opportunities for people who can't, let's say, get involved directly in the Corps, but could assist OVC in some other way? What would you say to them?
Kira, you want to take it?
So, sure, yeah. So, I mean, you said what is our first request always, which is prayer, because it's really, it is a labor of love and prayer, and we really rely on that support and the grace of God to do this work. Secondly, as a new ministry, it is really helpful to us for folks to just help us spread the word about Orthodox Volunteer Corps. If there are young adults in your community, maybe it's a grandson, a granddaughter, a niece, a nephew, son or daughter, friend, who you think would be interested in something like this, please nominate them to the program. That's another way that you can get involved, is actually nominating young adults. And we really see that this program, well, yes, there's a full-time program. It's an intensive, 10 months. If you nominate someone, if someone from your community participates in OVC, when they come back to your community, their ability to lead and help your community serve those in need most effectively is going to just significantly increase. I mean, we really see that in our first cohort. So we see you investing in your young adults through OVC as an investment in your community. And for those who live in the Pittsburgh area, for right now, we are launching a part-time program this fall for young adults who cannot participate in the full-time program but are still interested in service, or still interested in our curriculum and the formation component and community. And so we're going to be offering a part-time program in Pittsburgh. So if anyone's listening and is from Pittsburgh, we certainly encourage you to apply or to engage in the part-time program.
Yeah, and if you're a community that wants to have OVC be in your community working and having a volunteer corps member of OVC, I think there's a way to apply on your website. And of course, I'm sure you need funding. So people who are interested in building a program like this. Well, you mentioned before we got on air that, you've got a couple of questions that you wanted to talk about as we're talking about OVC that relate to the work that you're doing. Why don't we take one of those questions now? And whoever wants to start, Michael or Kyra, whoever, or Kira. I'm sorry that I got that mispronunciation stuck in my mind, but Kitty Key would help me if I just remember it that way. But whoever wants to ask a question first, that'd be great.
Kira, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that we've noticed is that while there is certainly a strong statistic that we see that young people are leaving the church, we've also seen that young adults want to serve and make an impact in the world. And so I wanted to ask you, Father Evan, is that something that you see with the young adults that you work with? And if so, in what ways are they seeking to serve and make an impact on the world?
Maybe I live in a little bit of a bubble, and I can just say that I've experienced the exact opposite. It's really a testament to, I think, the vibrancy of the faith of many young adults in the community that I serve in, who are desperate to find ways that they can expand their service to the body of Christ and to their sisters and brothers in need outside of it. And, we have not seen that, movement away, but rather we've seen an influx, almost, sometimes it feels like a deluge, and people are desperate for ways to connect their faith to their life, right, and their vocation. And so, one of the programs that we've leaned on heavily has been Project Mexico and the internships that people do in the summer, and some go, in the winter or during spring break, let's say. And then some of the opportunities that come up through, let's say, OCF, Orthodox Christian Fellowship and the college ministry. And then when you go beyond that, it's opportunities that come up through IOCC or OCMC. Now, as you know, a lot of those opportunities are of shorter length, right? And something that's incredible about what you're doing is that you're giving people an opportunity for a 10-month stay where they get to work in place. And as you said, I think correctly, that their opportunity is something that will not only transform them, but it will transform the community they go back to. So I really think that there is this growing desire amongst faithful Christians in the Orthodox world who want to see a way to connect faith to life, right? And to daily life. And, the truth of the matter is, without that ability to connect what we have come to believe in our hearts as true, that the Lord Jesus is the Messiah and that his gospel is the light of the world, that basic element of belief, if it cannot then translate into an action in the world, you're impoverished. You're impoverished spiritually, you're impoverished vocationally, you're impoverished in your perspective on the world. And so I think that the opposite is true. I'm more along the lines that you're viewing this, that I think there's the fields are, let's say, as the Lord said, white for harvest. And I think there are a plethora of young adults who want to enter into this type of reality. I don't know. You want to comment back on that?
Well, just that I would say that I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive, like young people leaving the church and an interest in desiring to serve. And so I would just say that from our vantage point, what we've seen is that, like the harvest is ripe. Young people they want to serve. They want to make an impact. And I think that if you are fortunate enough to be in a community where,
there's opportunity.
There's opportunity for that. I see young adults living into that. And that's what we've seen with our first cohort and with many of the young adults who have applied. Yeah. I think one of the things that's been really important to us is in seeing this desire for service, we see it so deeply rooted in the faith. We look at the examples of like St. Basil and St. Maria of Paris, and we're saying Orthodoxy has so much to offer, this understanding of service to the world. So how do we bridge that for those who might be thinking of leaving, I guess I should say?
Well, I think you said something important. It's, they're not mutually exclusive. It is my perspective as a parish priest and also someone who gets to work on issues outside of my parish that the linkage between faith and action is essential for the health of the individual Christian, and then essential for the health of the community, the parish, the local Eucharistic community. And I think that, that matrix of spiritual and communal health is made firm by the opportunity to put our faith into practice, right? And it really isn't a mistake that the gospel ends in Matthew with the Lord calling to our attention, and we'll read this in a few weeks in this period of preparing for the Great Lenten journey, of those sheep on the right who, when someone was thirsty or hungry or naked and unclothed or sick and imprisoned, they were feeding, bringing drink, clothing, visiting, right? And they had this direct connection from their faith in God, their belief in the truth that he's given us, and then their action, right? So what you're doing and this emerging reality could not be more important in my view, right? Yeah, it just is, it's an essential piece. And as you mentioned, Orthodoxy in America has not had the opportunity to develop this national volunteer corps until now. Wow, how wonderful, right? That it's now available.
Thank God.
Yeah, thank God indeed. Yeah. Michael, I know you had a question as well. Let's jump over and take that one as well.
Sure. And before I ask it, Father, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to hear your just you share a bit about what's happening at your parish, because it has been so important to us as we have developed Orthodox Volunteer Corps that we root this work just deeply in the church, because this work of like developing a heart for service and then forming that heart within this community and then pouring in through this formation, none of it works if it is not all rooted in the church. And so I'm just really grateful to hear your example.
Well, I mean, it's not that I want to plug my latest book, but literally this is exactly what I talk about in the first part of the book, that there's this defining matrix of what makes a Eucharistic community healthy. And it's first that commitment to Christ and the gospel. Second, it is the living of that commitment day by day within my community and outside the walls of my community. And third, what occurs when that happens is the formation of a spiritual family and the interconnected reality of forming relationships with people outside and within the church. And that is such an important, let's say, three-legged stool. Without all three of those components, I mean, we could just say, well, we're like any volunteer corps, and we just go out and help whomever, but that would be missing the faith component. Or we could say, well, I have faith and I want to go do this work and I'm kind of do it on my own, but that misses the communal aspect, right? And the church in her wisdom, through the revelation of Jesus Christ, understands that all three of those pieces have to be in place for us to be truly our healthiest. We're not going to see those other things aren't healthy, right? Truly as healthy as Christians as we can be, all three need to be there, right? So amen to that, right? So
yeah.
Well,
this
go ahead.
So, just this morning, when I arrived at church, a friend pulled up. He had picked up, a neighbor who comes to our parish on a regular basis, and he's struggling in some very tangible ways, right? And so that, like, when we got him out of the car, literally, we had to pull up his pants. We had to, because he's struggling in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. And so we dressed him kind of on the street. Mm-hmm. Then we all went in together, right? And together we celebrated liturgy, and the depth and the breadth of that experience. And then for the core members to be able to experience that fullness of, what's happening in the liturgy, and then reaching out, to the community, and it's been very powerful.
So I'm so happy to hear things like that occurring. The little bit, the nitty gritty things, the big things. That's all important, right? Michael, you mentioned a question as we were getting ready for the show that really I think is essential to the work that you're all doing and the things that people are encountering while they're doing the work. So why don't you share that question?
Yes. So in direct service, one encounters suffering in very tangible ways, not unlike the story I just told of this morning. And on the one hand, it seems that suffering creates opportunities for encountering Christ in a new way. I'm thinking about how we just cry out to God when we are suffering. And so there's this amazing opportunity. At the same time, the suffering itself just seems inherently bad, like it's just this gratuitous evil. So how do we understand suffering in all its complexity when we think about service?
Well, this question comes up time and again in the pastoral ministry of a parish priest, right? Whether it's finding out that a family member has a terminal disease, whether it's an injury that someone sustains, whether it's the sudden death of a loved one, these are, if you will, in a parish as large and active as mine, these are weekly things. And of course, the people that either are experiencing them firsthand or experiencing the suffering of one of their family members or friends, as OVC volunteers will do, naturally come up against this profound reality that suffering somehow doesn't fit with our appreciation for a God who loves humanity and created the universe with love, right? And so there's this almost dissonance, right? And I think the church really beautifully handles the conversation around suffering in such a way that we don't end up in easy buckets, easy answers. And we also are okay with some of the ambiguity and tension, right? And so let me share a bit of what I mean here. One of the ways the church talks about suffering, it uses a phrase, the mystery of suffering, right? And here we don't mean mystery in the sense of something we can never understand, but rather something we can only understand in part, right? And so we should not, when we encounter suffering, say, well, there is an easy, explicit, definable answer, right? That would be, I think, a little short-sighted and myopic, right? But rather what we need to say is that there is a mystery here, something we cannot fully understand. And of course, we take that idea and we apply it when we think of the death of Christ on the cross, right? The mystery of the cross. Why did God suffer and die? Now, again, any attempt to answer that question that is too explicit, too logical, will somehow make the response too brittle and it'll be too shallow, right? God is all powerful. So could God have saved us without dying on a cross? The answer has to be yes, right? But he chose suffering and he endured suffering. And so we see that God himself moves through suffering and through it brings about the resurrection and brings about new life. And again, it's impossible for us to completely comprehend why suffering must exist. And yet God himself does not seek to avoid it, right? He doesn't seek to sort of skirt it, but rather he faces the cross himself and enters into suffering and identifies with the broken and the brokenhearted and the disfigured and the hungry, right? And so God is not absent from suffering, right? Is one of the ways that we, in our response to suffering, we speak. We also, I think, have to deal with the fact that suffering, right, does bring about in those who suffer and those who are around those who suffer a new and often purified existence. And this is very hard for us to deal with, but it's true, right? Do you know what I'm talking about here, Michael?
Yeah, I think so, but please say more.
Okay. So time and time again, as I have been alongside, I say that word important, it's an important word, as I come alongside people who are in suffering. I don't come sort of above, I'm not sort of behind, I'm not in front, I'm not pushing, I'm not pulling, but rather the appropriate position when someone's suffering is to be alongside, right? When you come alongside someone who is suffering, you almost always hear this suffering, this whatever it might be, is not something I ever wanted or hoped for or wished for, and I would never wish it on anyone else. But they'll often then say, but what I have gained and how it has changed me is not something I'm willing to give up. There's sort of a purification, a sanctification that comes through suffering that is not acquired anywhere else. It is not to say that we therefore go looking for suffering. The church, in fact, condemned that as a heresy. But it is true that the church recognizes that in suffering, especially when we don't, let's say, become embittered, right? When we don't become angry to the point of cursing both God and those helping us, that in suffering we are sanctified, we are purified, and it's like a knife being rubbed on a stone. When we're suffering, that friction does sharpen the blade, right? Now, on previous episodes, Michael, I've talked about, what are the origins of suffering? What is the origin of sickness and evil and death? And it isn't in God, right? Now, I think more germane to the question you're bringing up is the fact that OVC members are encountering suffering, but no longer at a distance, right? They're not hearing about it in the paper, listening to it on the news, reading about it in a textbook. They're actually, as you mentioned in just the story this morning, hands-on, right? Looking into the eyes of, binding up the wounds of those who are suffering, right? And here's the thing. That type of interaction, as I said, it isn't just about the person suffering. It creates the bond and the connection between the sufferer and the one caring. And that person who comes alongside is not, again, in front or behind, but alongside. And in my own parish, we're getting new iconography right now, and I had told the parish that the two icons I wanted them to be greeted by when they entered the church was the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. The Good Samaritan, for obvious reasons, that, the Lord taught us that when we see our brother or sister in need, we are to love them more than we love ourselves, and that is to have compassion, right? And the Greek there is very strong. It literally means to feel in ourselves the pain and the suffering that the other person is feeling. And that's what's happening in those OVC core members when they're dealing with the needs of others. They themselves are taking into their own lives that other person's suffering. And that changes you, right?
Yeah.
And would it be true that it would be nice if we could change in a different way? Yes, but we don't seem to. So that's one of the reasons we also call it a mystery. It seems as if God allows suffering as a means for our own transformation. And there's, again, something holy that occurs there, right? And so, Michael, I don't know, any thoughts on your own about that?
First off, I really appreciate the nuance of your reflections, Father. It seems just very important in terms of reflecting on the experiences that are just the human experience of suffering. A second thought is, especially as you were connecting it at the end to thinking about the core members at OBC and encountering suffering on a very visceral way. We often speak about creating opportunities for service with vulnerable communities, and the word "with" is very important there. It's about that walking alongside, as opposed to in front or any other place. And there's a certain kind of vulnerability in a community that is, say, low income, or someone who has been incarcerated. But there's also and I think there's a linkage, right, between suffering and vulnerability, that when one is suffering, that it's just really clear kind of vulnerability, and when one walks alongside another who is suffering, there's a possibility for you then to be vulnerable, and I know from my own experience, like the moments that I have been most vulnerable with another human being, there is danger in that because of the vulnerability, but there's also incredible possibility for love to happen there. And there's richness in that. And so to see that happen with the core members, and the connection here then with, with suffering and vulnerability and love is just, there's something really mysterious and beautiful about that.
Yeah, the two phrases I often use in pastoral care is I'll say that's the holy dilemma. When we come face to face with the brokenness of another, the brokenness of ourselves, there's the holy dilemma. Like it can lead to, as you said, this great opportunity for love, but it can also make us a monster. And the way of the saints is it leads towards love. The way of those who separate themselves from God and their brothers and sisters, then it's not the way of love, right? And the second one that I just mentioned here is, of course, the church in all facets seeks to alleviate suffering, right? But not in this sort of platonic, or I would even say, what's the word I'm looking for? Where you sort of create this false reality where everything's just perfect, and great, sort of a Shangri-La, right? But she seeks to alleviate suffering, but in doing so, she recognizes, again, that idea of purification and sanctification. And then also she says, look, while we don't seek suffering and while we seek to alleviate it, while we're suffering or when we're suffering, we do have to recognize that we cannot suffer. Again, a phrase I like to use a lot is a double loss. So I'll often have people who, let's say, are diagnosed with cancer, or they lose their marriage or a job, and I'll say, you can become embittered over this. And then you suffer the double loss. Not only did you lose your health, but then you lost your connection to God, to your brothers, to your sisters, to your faith. And that's a double loss. And yet those who seem to suffer and then move toward their sisters and brothers, move towards God, that is not what they encounter, right? And that leads into that sort of mystery of what they say to you through the process of suffering. But, well, Kiriki, Michael, we spent a lot more time than I thought we would, but I think it was worth it. We were just going to try to do 10 minutes, but it's so important to talk about this incredible work of OVC, or Orthodox Volunteer Corps. I guess any last plug before you guys jump off?
Just so good to talk to you, Father. I really appreciate it, and we love to have folks apply if they're interested at orthodoxvolunteercorps.org. But thank you so much, Father.
That's wonderful. Kiriki?
Yep, that's what I was going to say. A word of gratitude to you and to anyone out there who knows a young adult, ages 21 to 29. It's not too late to apply to Orthodox Volunteer Corps. So please reach out to us if anyone has any questions about it as well. You can find our info on the website.
I just want to say, may God bless, guide, protect this incredible new ministry, and big things God will do through this ministry. I'm certain of it. It's just going to grow and grow and grow. So how exciting to be part of the beginnings, Kiriki and Michael, of it. May God always bless the works of your hands, and for his glory and for the service of those that OVC core group members and cohorts encounter. God bless you guys, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, and thank God.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, everybody. You are listening to Orthodoxy Live. If you'd like to call in as Kiriki and Michael drop off, it opens up a line for you at 1-855-237-2346. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Orthodoxy Live with Father Evan will be back in a moment. In the meantime, lines are open at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346.
Jesus' last words to his disciples were, "Go and make disciples of all the nations." Unfortunately, many parishes are struggling to follow this commandment. In Reclaiming the Great Commission, Father Evan Armatas offers a roadmap to help us get back on track. Relying on his 20 years of parish experience, Holy Scripture, and insights from research and his visits with churches across the U.S., he discusses how you and your community can implement changes that will transform, revitalize, and renew your parish. You'll learn how to diagnose and remove the barriers you face, deal with resistance to change, define what a healthy parish looks like, lead with purpose, and create a parish health plan. Written for clergy, council members, ministry leaders, small groups, and all committed parishioners, this book will help any church in its journey to reclaim the Great Commission. Purchase it today at store.ancientfaith.com.
Father Evan is ready for your call, and our lines are open at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Here once again is Father Evan.
Well, welcome back. We're going to go right out to the phones and speak with my friend Alexis. Hi, Alexis.
Hey, Father.
Thanks for introducing me to Kyriaki and to Michael.
Yes, I'm just so impressed with what they're doing, and we've got to spread the word.
Yeah, well, it's just going to keep growing because there's just too many people out there who want to connect. I just know of so many Orthodox Christians in the past who've looked elsewhere for those opportunities. And, I mentioned it in my book too. Be patient with the Orthodox Church in America. In many ways, it's really just the new kid on the block. We're still getting ourselves settled, and how neat that this is starting. I just think it's going to grow and grow and grow. So I think big things will happen with that. It's incredible.
Yeah. I like how they call it, instead of a gap year, a gain year. For young people.
It's so good, right? A gain year. Well, What's going on?
Well, I wanted to invite all the listeners out there, especially those around the Atlanta metropolis or in the South, to our Lenten retreat in Birmingham, Alabama at the end of the month.
Yeah, it's going to happen February what?
24th and 25th at Holy Trinity, Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Birmingham, Alabama.
So if they want to register, where do they go?
They go to holytrinity-holycross.org, and they'll see a tile there with your picture on it that says Lenten Retreat.
I'm starting a month of travel, and I've got something next week, then I've got something the week after that. I'll be with the Romanian Archdiocese clergy, then I'll be with you all. Then I'll be at a Clean Monday retreat that I'm leading at St. Catherine's in Greenwood Village. So if you're in Colorado, you can come to that. So it'll be a busy month.
Yeah, thank you, Father, so much for taking the time to come back to Birmingham. We're really, really excited about your visit.
Well, I think what's interesting about this retreat is we're going to spend time talking about the light of Christ and our own baptisms. The light of Christ and its relationship to our community, and then the light of Christ and how it relates to those outside, right? And a little teaser, there are three major liturgical actions that we participate in as Christians when we go to church that speak to each of those three. And I just think, because we haven't thought about it and examined it, we may be, if you will, asleep to the fact that the church is constantly inviting us to consider the light in me, the light in my community, and the light out in the world, right? And so we're going to try and tease that out over the weekend.
Yeah, it really kind of connects some to what Kira and Michael were talking about as well. Like, how do we take this light of Orthodox Christianity and serve the people around us?
Yeah, I mean, amen to that. And the reality is, as you and I have talked about, and as people themselves, I think, encounter the gospel, it has to have somewhere to go. Mm-hmm. If you just think about it in the most basic of ways, right? So if I've got a container and I fill it, as it begins to fill and it gets to the brim, where does that go? Right? And if we try to keep it in the container, we could think of it like fruit. Like my wife always buys bananas, always. I mean, every time she goes to the store, she buys bananas. But my kids don't eat as many bananas as she buys. So there's always a couple of bananas going brown, right? And that's because they didn't get eaten. And, the same is true of our faith, that if our faith doesn't get incorporated into our very bodies and then put into the energy and action of what it means to be a Christian, it'll just rot, Right. And that's happening in a lot of people's lives and a lot of communities because they've forgotten that connection. And so the light in me, the light in my community, and the light outside, right? It's an essential linkage. And you can't have just one, right? You have to have all three. And so I'm glad you're inviting people to come because I think it'll be important. Is there any way, if you can attend, is a way that going to be streamed or recorded and people can check it out later or what?
Yeah, we're really good at posting these retreats. A couple days after the retreat, it'll be on our website, and we have a YouTube channel. So it won't be streamed live, but you will definitely be able to watch the retreat if you're not able to be with us in person.
It's actually a good thing that you don't do it live. It makes it, a requirement to be there, right? That's important.
Right. We want to see you in Birmingham for sure.
Well, it's important to be together, right? The less virtual, the better, right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Alexis. Look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Father.
Okay, good night. Well, again, you're listening to Orthodoxy Live here on Ancient Faith Radio, and our number is 1-855-237-2346. We're going to go to a pre-recorded question that came in from a middle high school Sunday school class. So let's take a listen.
Hi, Father Evan. This is Anna Grace Stefanovich. I'm here with the middle school church school class at St. Spiridon. So I'm here with
Ellery, Farron, Finn, Evie, Asa, Anna,
and Kevin.
And we had a question. We're studying Joseph and the highs and lows of his life in the Old Testament. And so Ellery is going to ask the question that we have.
How do we know that God is faithful even in hard times?
Thank you, Father Evan.
How do we know that God is faithful in hard times? Well, we probably need to start our answer by recognizing why a question would be asked around such a topic when studying Joseph. And for those of us who know the story of Joseph, it occupies something like 30% of the book of Genesis. So a pretty large portion of the book of Genesis covers the life of Joseph. And interestingly, when the church gets to Holy Week, the week that precedes Pascha, we spend a lot of time thinking about, in hymns, the life of Joseph. And many identified very early in the life of the church that Joseph was a type of Christ, right? But how do we know, that God is active and with us even in hard times? Well, in the life of Joseph, this comes out in a series of events. The first of them being that Joseph himself ends up, if you will, despised by his very own family and his brothers, and they seek to destroy him. Their first inclination is to murder him, and they decide not to because of one of the brothers, Reuben, who persists in staying the hand of his brothers and saying, let's not kill him, let's just throw him into this pit, and then, there's this traveling band of Ishmaelites, let's just sell him into slavery. And then we'll just pretend that we killed him, or that not that we killed him, but that he was killed by a wild animal, and we'll take his clothing back to our dad with the blood of a goat on it and tell him it was a beast that got him, right? And so that's what they do. And as he gets down into Egypt, he ends up working in a home, and then there's a series of events where the mistress of the home tries to seduce him, and then he ends up in prison, and and he spends a couple of years in prison before he's released. And the question could become, how could this reality, the progression of his life, in any way be associated with the promises, the blessings of God? Well, later we see that Joseph rises to a place of prominence, and he ends up actually saving his family from famine. And he tells his brothers, when he reunites with them, that though they had intended to do him evil, God had used it for good. And so why am I sort of giving this long sort of summary of the life of Joseph? It goes back to what I was saying even to Michael earlier in tonight's program, that, when we endure some sort of hardship or difficulty or challenge, we are often in the middle of the story, and we cannot see the purpose or point. And the story of Joseph illustrates that when we get to the end of the story, we see that all that occurred, his being sold into slavery, his imprisonment, was actually part of a larger plan that leads to a set of blessings that could not have come about except by God's design. So one of the things that we can say is that the Lord of our lives, the one who loves us from the time of our conception, has an eye towards what is good for us. And he is opportunistic. He doesn't cause bad things to happen, but he'll use them to bring about good. Now, only in the situation like Joseph's do we see that Joseph doesn't move against God's hand, doesn't curse God, but rather stays faithful. And we see something good come about. But you might say, well, what about the case where, bad things happen? I don't like it when they're happening. I don't stay close to God when they happen. Well, that's also something we find in the scriptures as well, through the person of King David and what he did in his life that was not according to the plan of God. And yet God, once again, being opportunistic in the sense of wanting to restore and have relationship. Or we can see it in the life of Peter, Peter denying the Lord, or in the situation of Judas, where Judas not only betrays him, but then doesn't, if you will, repent of and move back towards God, right? Now, more to say here. Look, in the end of the day, God's purpose and design is to remain and develop a more deep connection with us. And through the trials of our lives, that's often the time in which we, because of our difficulty or challenge or suffering, wake up enough to turn our eyes and our attention towards God. And often this is in a negative situation where we're, suffering, and we may cry out against God. But what if we cried out to God, right? What if we found a way in those difficult times to cry to God and to move toward him, right? There would be a blessing from that. And, the only way that we can test that is to do that in those times of tribulation. That doesn't mean that those things will be easy, right? By any stretch, right? All right. Thanks for the question. We're going to go back out to the phones and take a call from John. John, are you there? Hello, John. Are you there? Welcome to Orthodoxy Live, John. You on air? Okay. Looks like we're having a little difficulty connecting with John. We'll give that. Well, John, are you there? Hello? John? All right. Do we need to take a quick break and see if we can get John back? All right. Well, let me say, I guess, one additional thing about this idea of God's presence and how do we know that God will be present with us. I want to also say this. It's not as if we can know something, let's say, in that experience of suffering at all times. Sometimes when we're in suffering, we feel the absence of God, and we don't feel the presence of God. And that's a real experience, right? We feel forsaken. We feel abandoned. We feel sometimes people even say cursed or punished. Now, of course, none of those things are the teaching of the church nor the way of God, but that can be how we feel. And I do want to say this, when going through such emotions and experiences, we who come alongside people like that shouldn't dismiss those emotions and feelings. It's okay to sit within those, right? And this goes back to my first point in answering that question, that sometimes it's just a matter of seeing where that journey is going to go and being patient enough to see where it's going to play out. Now, sometimes the ending isn't great. We don't find a cure for our sickness. We don't find that our loved one is reunited to us, right? That it's not all happy endings, right? But in the process of going through that hardship, as I said earlier in the program, we may find that we've gained something, right? And we don't suffer the double loss, but rather we are purified and sanctified. All right, let's see if we got John back. John, you there?
I'm here, Father.
Oh, hello, John. Welcome. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina.
Well, welcome to the program. Sorry about the difficulty about getting you on air.
No worries. No worries.
Well, as we're running up against the hour, let's just jump right in. John, tell me your question.
Sure. So I'm a Sunday school teacher, and today we started a new series about putting God first. And we talked today about putting God first in your finances. And I know in your books you've talked a lot about almsgiving and, of course, when it talks about its relationship to parish health and whatnot. So I was curious if you had to give a quick C about how you teach stewardship to young people. What's your best method?
Well, I think, first of all, I would say that you're attempting to teach it to people who are young is important, right? Because generosity is learned. That's the first thing that I would say, is that, don't dismiss the simple, practical, straightforward teaching that generosity is important. And generosity is a part of our spiritual lives, and generosity is something that God encourages and commands us to do. That straight up is an important part of teaching generosity, right? The expectation that we will not just be a taker, but we will be a giver. The expectation that we will take from what we have, even to the point of doing with less in order to serve someone else. That's straightforward gospel. So it's okay to just say, hey guys, here's the truth. Here's what God has taught us, right? And so I think, kids are sharp enough that they don't need to be tricked, right? So I think that straightforward method is important. Second, how old are your kids that you're teaching?
12th graders.
Okay, so they're seniors in high school, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then they need something practical too. So I would say if you're going to teach them about generosity and tithing, are you setting up a way for them to do it? I mean, are you just teaching about the concept, or are you actually passing a tray and setting up volunteer opportunities?
Right. I think that's the important thing, because if you don't teach them the tools of the trade, then the lesson isn't as important, because
it's just theoretical.
Correct.
Right. The third thing that I think you can do, so the first one was just to say, hit them straight with what this is about and why we do it, right? And, you can connect so many gospel passages, right, to the idea of generosity. The second one that you can do is just the practical, like you need to set up ways for them to get engaged in giving, right? Not just dollars, but time and talent. The third thing is to have an exploration of what they themselves would like to be generous with. We don't have to have generosity that looks the same. So in discussing this with high schoolers, we can say, gosh, if you had an opportunity to be generous, to bless someone else, how would you go about it? right? How would you deploy the resources of your life? You know, and people have different approaches, you know, and that's why we have so many different saints, right?
Right.
The fourth thing that I would say is, like any spiritual tool, which generosity is, it is practiced, and I'm going to give you two words, in humility and obedience. There's no progress without those two. So I think teaching generosity and giving and tithing with the virtues of humility and obedience, I would talk about those. Now, we hear a lot about humility these days, and we certainly heard some this morning. And humility is a word that everybody likes, you know. Not a lot of people say, "Oh, humility is stupid," or "humility is wooden," or "humility is dry," but they don't like the word obedience. Most people, right? But you can have a really, I think, wonderful conversation about, tell me any good thing that's happening in your life that didn't require you to have some level of obedience. You know, so if you're a good guitar player, if you're a great writer, if you're a good athlete, if you're healthy, you know, what of those things came about by negligence? You following me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think when we're young, we can be a little bit too, at least I was, I can be up in the clouds. And it was good to hear from someone above me years ago that I did not progress spiritually because I wasn't humble or obedient. And so I think that fourth part of just sitting down and saying, look, guys, let's talk about this. This is something that we are going to practice in humility. Right? We're not going to call attention to what we're doing. For purposes of our discussion, we might, because we're trying to learn and grow. But then as we deploy those time, talents, and treasures in the world, we're going to do those as humbly, as quietly, as simply as we can. But we also know that we need to do them obediently. So we can't be streaky, you know, sort of like, well, I just wrote my check for $100. I'm good till next year. That is not practicing generosity. Right? Generosity is something we're obedient to day in and day out, right? That we look daily for opportunities to be generous, right? So that's a quick and dirty, John.
I love it. It's very useful.
Thank you, John. Thanks for calling in. Have a great evening.
Thank you as well.
Okay, bye-bye. Well, thanks everybody for listening. You have been listening to Orthodoxy Alive here on Ancient Faith Radio. I'm your host, Father Evan. It's been a pleasure to be with you as you get underway on your Lenten journey. Check out those resources, as I said, on the store here at Ancient Faith. And if you get an opportunity, also check out the Pascha Passport at the Lenten Embassy. For Orthodoxy Live and Ancient Faith Radio, I'm Father Evan. Good night and God bless.